going to show you guys how to composite the Froggy pose in Photoshop. First, I'm starting with the image that is going to be the main image I have open here. And this is straight out of Lightroom or straight out of RAW here. So it already has Lightroom edits applied to it. We just threw on one of our presets. This one is Moody Film 8 from our Moody Film set. And I'm starting with the image that is going to be the majority of what I use for the final edit, and literally the only thing that I'm going to be editing out here is my hand and my arm. So I'm not using any like face swapping or anything here. This is just going to be the main part of the image. The only thing I'm swapping in is the top of her head. So I'm starting with that open in Photoshop. I'm going to go into Finder where the location of the other part of the image is right here. And this is just going to be the top of the head part. So I'm going to drag that onto my image so that it just places it here as a smart object. It already has the transform option up here for this layer. I'm going to decrease the opacity to somewhere around 50% so I can see both layers here. And just move this top layer around, and if you have to transform it slightly, you can, just to get it to the correct position. You might have to rotate it a little bit. I always try to get this image as perfectly lined up as possible when I transfer from the bottom half to the top half. But it's never exact. So there's always going to be a little bit of, rotating, maybe a little bit of resizing. And if it's just a slight amount, then that's no big deal at all. So I think I have it pretty well lined up here. I'm mostly just looking at this area because this is the only part that I'm going to composite in. So I'm okay with that. I'm going to hit check and then increase the opacity to 100%. So now I can see the top layer that I have on here. What I want to hide this layer kind of. I'm going to add a layer mask to the top of the head layer. And then I'm going to invert the layer mask to be all black instead of all white. So to do that, you hit Command I or Control I if you're on a PC. And then with the brush tool, make sure you have it at 0% hardness and 100% opacity up here. I'm going to take a white brush and just brush on where my hand is, just to make it blend in right there. Awesome. And that looks pretty good to me. It wasn't like perfectly lined up, but you would never know. So that looks pretty good. You see before and after. Just make sure the headband lines up good enough and stuff. So before, after. I'm going to go ahead and merge that down. And over here where there's a little bit of a line there, I'm just going to take my healing brush tool and sample an area over here and then brush on. To sample, you hold down Alt or Option and click and then brush on the area. So the reason I selected this image to show you guys a Froggy composite is because there is also some shadowing here where the backdrop didn't quite smooth out in camera. And I'm going to show you how I would do that on this image because this backdrop has a little bit of a texture to it. I don't want to just use frequency separation because it's going to make it look over smoothed. Even though frequency separation can retain the texture, since this texture is pretty out of focus, it's gonna look over smooth if I try to fix it with frequency separation. So I'm gonna duplicate my layer and use the dodge tool here. I'm gonna start with changing the range to shadows, and I always have my dodge and burn tools set to a really low exposure because I like it to be a gradual change. Like if you bring the exposure up, it's just really it's really harsh. It's a really harsh paint, change when you paint it on. I just want it to be a more gradual thing where I kind of have to paint over it quite a bit to get it to change. So I have it set to like 9%. I don't know why, but that's just me. That's a preference, whatever your preference is. So I'm just gonna go over it here with the dodge tool in just these shadows where the backdrop was wrinkled pretty extremely there. So doing that and having it set to the shadows range is mostly going to affect the areas that are darkest. And so as I do that, you can see that it actually changes the tone slightly, or actually the saturation of the backdrop. So it's kind of making it almost a little bit gray in those areas, and I'll show you how to deal with that in a second too. But first I'm going to get it to about the same luminosity as the rest of the drop to make it look more even. And then it's not taking out all that texture there. So you're just kind of brightening it up without over smoothing it. And it really didn't affect the saturation too much, but I'm going to show you, sometimes it really makes it gray where you're dodging it, and I'm going to show you how to deal with that. So after you're all done and it looks like a pretty good brightness level, you can go up to your blending mode here and change it to luminosity. And actually in this case it actually made it worse. So it's actually even more gray here than with normal. So I'm going to leave it at normal. And another way you can make sure everything's the same tone is just make a blank layer and change the blending mode of your blank layer to color. And then take a brush, sample the color that you want that area to be, and just paint over that. I'm going to lower the opacity of my brush so it's not like a super intense effect, but now you see it looks a lot more even with the color tone. Okay, so you can go ahead and merge that down. And I'm going to get these, and I'm going to make a new layer again, or duplicate the layer again. And now I'm going to do another dodge over here and over here. And for these, I'm going to set it to midtones because these areas are slightly lighter than this was. So I really just want to affect the midtones. I'm going to, because you kind of eyeball it in your image and say, okay, this is about a midtone, range in your image. That was more of a shadow. So just depending on what type of area you're wanting to brighten up, you just kind of select that in your range. And I'm just going to very, very lightly, very gradually brighten up just kind of paint on, those areas that are more of a wrinkle in your fabric. You can also use the burn tool, which is also over here. You just change it to the burn tool. And I'm also going to have midtones selected here, but go over the highlights next to where you already did the darker spots. So just dodge and burn, just kind of make everything even. Where there was a wrinkle, now it looks like it's all smooth there. I'm going to see what changing this to luminosity does, if that makes it look better or worse. Yeah, that actually makes it look a lot more even when I change that to luminosity. So that blending mode is going to change the you know, the brightness or dark, or it's going to carry over how light or dark that layer is without affecting the hue or the saturation. So merge that down. And that looks pretty even to me. Looks pretty even. I'm going to also add a haze to this image too. And that, with our haze action, that's just going to add kind of like a more finished look, like an ethereal. It'll pull a color from the background and it's just going to automatically apply this nice haze here. You can change the opacity of that too to your liking. I always kind of like to select that whole action grouping and take a big soft black brush and just plop it on baby's face, just so that haze isn't covering the baby anywhere. And I would also run I'm going to merge that down there, and I'm going to run our skin smoother action. These are all kind of in different action sets. I've just pulled them into a set that has a bunch of the actions that I use in here. And so these are all our actions, but they come, you know, the haze is its own action set. The skin smoother is in the skin retouching set. And I'm just going to, with a 100% opacity brush over the areas of baby's skin that I want to be nice and even. It doesn't do anything to the texture of baby's skin. It's only smoothing out the tones. So if you zoom way in, and hopefully you can see this a little bit, it retains the texture of the skin without, you know, it doesn't affect that at all, but it'll smooth out the tones to make baby's skin look nice and finished. So it's pretty subtle, but before, after.